Cairo, Seattle.
It's time to get schooled with the professor, John Clayton.
Welcome to Schooled with the Professor, and I'll tell you, this is going to be really fun because obviously, I love analytics. I love the study of different things and also to look into the future. And one company that's into the future but now is in the present is Zebra. Zebra, of course, Seattle guy here, and John Pollard, who runs things. And what Zebra is, and of course there was a big announcement last week that the stats now are going to really be analyzed on the NextGen and all that, and they've finally got that going to 32 teams. I mean, this is something that's been years in the making, and it's really come out. And joining us right now with School to Professor is John Pollard. And John, first off, take us through the announcement, because I know everybody from really about a year or maybe 2 years ago have been waiting for this to come through. Now all 32 teams are going to have even more access with chips and all these different studies on things that's going to be really impactful in the National Football League.
Yeah, it was an exciting time for us, John, and thanks for having me on. The announcement that came out last week is, for the audience, now all teams will receive what we would call both sides of ball data. So when they're looking at the tracking data, for the last 4 years, and of course, we're in our fourth year of a 5-year relationship with the NFL being the official tracking technology partner. We're in the process of negotiating our extension or extending that relationship, and both the NFL and we at Zebra want to continue that. But for the first 4 years, we've been providing data, or the NFL's been providing data for only one side of ball. So the Seahawks would only see their tracking data. Now, they could go to the NFL NextGen Stats site and see more of the fan version of the tracking data for all teams. But the real minutia, the analytics, as you talked about, they can only see their information. Last week's announcement means that the Seattle Seahawks can now use our tracking data and information to do scouting for, big opponents like the Rams, the Cardinals, and the 49ers in their division, for instance. And so it allows us at Zebra to, go even further in terms of what types of consultative support and research and analysis we can provide our team clients across the NFL.
Now, you're in Seattle. Now, is Zebra based here in Seattle?
No, Zebra's headquarters actually is in Lincolnshire, Illinois, which is north of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
We also are Sports Command Center, where we monitor each and every NFL game and practices for our practice clients. We have a sports headquarters and command center in San Jose, California. I just happen to be in Seattle. I came to Seattle 12 years ago for a job at Microsoft, and eventually evolved into the world of sports technology and analytics 12 years ago, and about 10 years ago. And that led to my departure from Microsoft. But I love Seattle, so I'm not going anywhere.
Well, that's good. So now take us through how this company started getting involved in this and then linking up with the National Football League.
Yeah, so Zebra is an interesting company. Zebra Technologies is a publicly traded company. We've been around since the late 60s, and the core of the business has been around consumer or enterprise-level printers and scanners, UPC code scanners, barcode scanners, asset tracking and analytics around industries such as automotive, operations, logistics, healthcare, and retail. And interestingly enough, Zebra Technologies, over 95% of the Fortune 500 companies across the world use some level of Zebra Technologies capabilities. And about 7 years ago, the NFL issued an RFP out to numerous technology companies to evaluate the potential and efficacy of having tracking technology available on the players and in the stadiums for fan engagement, and also analytics and information resources for teams. Zebra participated in the RFP process and literally took its heritage and capabilities in asset tracking and location services, took that capability and formed it to a sports environment for the NFL. And so, for the audience, our location tracking services is RFID-based technology, which, as you mentioned earlier, John, includes putting chips on the players in the shoulder pads. There's 2 chips on most players, 3 for down linemen. And we have receiver boxes that are around the perimeter of every NFL stadium. And those chips, if I may, talk to the boxes 12 times a second. And send information such as location, proximity data, speed, separation information, just tons of analytics. And so really for Zebra, it was an opportunity for us to take the heritage of the company and move it into a new unique vertical, which is the world of sports, and in this case, American football.
I remember going to the Sloan Convention, which is analytics, a couple years ago, and getting the idea where this was all heading. And what really drove, and of course we'll expand on where it's going in the National Football League, but Kevin Garnett was getting older and he's playing for the Boston Celtics. And what they did was they put the tracking system on him, and they noticed that his speed started to go down at the 7-minute interval of different games. And so what they ended up doing is they would rest him after 7 minutes. It gave him 2 more really good years because that rest enabled him to kind of regenerate the muscles and regenerate everything. And I would imagine this is going to be a big part of this in the National Football League.
That's exactly right, Sean, and that's a great example of where what this technology can do. Of course, all 32 teams have our game data provided by the NFL, so our system generates gameplay data and then distributes it to the team through the NFL itself. And then we have a third of the league using an analogous system that's in the stadium in their practice facilities. And so to your point, teams are now looking at kind of bringing the coaching staff and personnel staff and strength and conditioning coaches together, and they're watching players' capabilities throughout the entire season. What's their workload on a given practice, over a given week, over an accumulation of weeks throughout an entire season, and then taking that information and then saying, okay, is that impacting the performance on game day? A couple of really basic examples that we talk often when we talk to clubs is, look, you have a rookie player, let's say a rookie wide receiver, coming into the NFL, and he's not playing 12 games anymore. He's got a 17-week season. And of course, there's real potential for that player to ultimately hit the wall or become, physically exhausted at a certain point. So the training staff and the coaching staff, as well as the scouting staff, internally have to be really in tune with what that player is doing throughout the entire season, and then being very prescriptive in how they manage that player's capabilities throughout the season, and of course, even within a single week.
Now, I saw a thing that NFL.com used, and of course, this stuff goes into NextGen Stats, which the National Football League puts out, and they had an evaluation of the 10 best offensive lines, and I guess with the tracking system and that, how, for example, can you judge the offensive line and how they move and all that stuff, and which is good and which is not? How does that all work analytically?
Yeah, so with the chips in the shoulder pads for the players, a couple of things that we can do, and some of the formulas on the NextGen Stats is more a consumerized or a fan version of the analytics, and so as I'm sure you understand, John, the teams themselves get a little bit more detailed, if I may, in the analytics itself. But we can actually measure the distance of the splits between the offensive linemen. We can measure pocket integrity by using visualization capabilities in our software platform that we do provide to teams. The teams can actually take a look at pocket integrity and making sure that the pocket's the right shape and in the right place to accommodate the quarterback. They can also measure throwing lane capabilities with the tracking data as well. And one interesting thing, and I was looking at some stats in anticipation of our conversation today. Russell Wilson, with our tracking data, we saw Russell Wilson was second in the league with the most time to throw, second in time to throw throughout the year with a little over 3 seconds. But all of us here in Seattle do realize, too, that Russell creates a lot of that time himself, right, by moving around in the pocket. And in some cases, he's scrambling. In some cases, it's planned rollouts. And so it's one example where you can have a statistic and says, okay, time to throw, if your quarterback's second in the league in time to throw, then the offensive line must be really good at pass protection. Well, that may be true and it may be not. There's more context that you have to put around the information to evaluate it. But some of the examples I talked about on the offensive line are how we measure the quality of the offensive line using our tracking information.
And I would imagine also, particularly for older players, it gives you an idea. I mean, well, is it a miles per hour, or what type of thing do you kind of use as far as when you start to see a player start to fatigue?
Yeah, so the miles per hour that we're, basically the miles per hour translates, as you know, and I'm sure your audience knows, into the burst kind of metric or explosive metric that football people talk about often. And what I really like when I talk to teams, John, is that inevitably the first thing people ask is, or even a player, if you're tracking me, that means the information can be used against me. So it's a bad news story for me. And actually, that may not be the case. If you're a player, let's just use a hypothetical example. If you're a 32 or 33-year-old running back with 10 years in the league, the kind of the conventional wisdom is that the likelihood of you getting a long-term contract or a 2-year contract with a team is fairly limited. But again, if you look at the performance and explosive capabilities in terms of miles per hour, If you look at in terms of for a wide receiver, for example, average separation from a defensive back that they get, you have the numbers can work in the favor of a veteran player to say, if I may, I have more tread on my tire, or I still have the skills to create separation. So it takes the age bias out of it and the tenure in the league bias out of it. And now you have quantifiable information where you can say that veteran player may be somebody who's worth investing in, putting on my roster, as long as I monitor and manage how I utilize them throughout the season.
And see, where this becomes so valuable, and I won't ask you to react to this because, again, it's just, visually seeing something. So, example, I'm on the sideline at a Dallas Cowboy game, and I can see with Des Bryant and their receiving core, they're getting very little separation from the cornerbacks and the guys that are defending them. So, not using the Cowboys as an example, I would imagine a metric like that would really be so visible when you're trying to evaluate a receiving core. Now, again, I'm not asking you to talk specifically of the Cowboy, but let's say that a receiving core that just doesn't get separation can be really noticeable in this.
So absolutely. And, one of the things that inspires me when I work with this stuff, John, is when I first started working in sports analytics and I got introduced, I won't name the team, with an NFL team back in 2007, and they basically let me into the inner workings of their scouting process. And I remember looking at some NFL scouting reports, and it was a defensive back scouting report, and there were qualifications or categories of performance like recognition to burst, twitch, explosiveness. And then next to those characterizations of those categories of performance, I saw numbers like one scout said that one player had a 6 in terms of burst. The same player for another scout had a 7. Another one had him at a 4. You're thinking, okay, well, how does a team actually weight these numbers that are very subjective? I mean, they have intelligence and expertise behind them, but there's such a differentiation between the various scouts. And when you talk to the general manager or the player personnel director at the time, they basically said, were explaining to me, well, those numbers, we kind of round them out. The veteran scout, well, we trust his eyes a little bit more, so we weight his number a little higher. If it's a first or second year scout or early in a career scout, we weight his number a little bit lower because he hasn't had as much experience. And so they were weighting the grades of these players. And so now, for the first time, and which we're really excited about talking about at the Combine in 2 weeks, is that we have something, the numbers that are generated from our system provide quantifiable information. True information, empirical data that now can either support, validate, or buttress a professional evaluator's assessment. And that has to be something that's really exciting for clubs, because that bias and that subjectivity is now balanced a little bit with actual numbers based on our technology. And we always do say this, John, and I'll say it every time I speak with somebody during an interview or in a presentation. We are not trying to replace the professional evaluator's eye. We're not a magic potion that takes away all the traditional scouting processes and procedures. What we are is a new premium ingredient of information that now teams and the evaluators can leverage to, again, validate and quantify and support their evaluations. And I think that helps teams become much more informed when they go and grading their players and setting their boards for the draft.
And just to give you an example of how valuable this could be, I know some of the analytics people that did some things with the Minnesota Vikings. A couple years ago, they were looking at Stephon Diggs, wide receiver, who ended up going in the 5th round. And some numbers just really came out from the different things that they saw. And they, took him in the 5th round and absolutely got a steal out of that. And I would imagine with the quantifiable numbers, particularly at a position like wide receiver, I mean, you can really take what might be considered sleepers and then really get a solid evaluation on them from those numbers.
Yeah, I agree, John, and that's exciting for us too. As you know, we covered the Senior Bowl this year. We put our tracking technology in the Senior Bowl in Mobile. It's the first year of this relationship that we've officially set up with the Senior Bowl. We'll be there for 5 seasons, so 4 more seasons after this past year. And I'll tell you, we had not only did we track the game itself, but as you know, the practices are really that's really the event during the week. The practices with all the general managers and the scouting staffs and coaches, watching up close how these players actually practice throughout the week with other players under professional coaching, with the NFL staffs being there. And, the information that we've provided is a library of information, not just on the player tracking, but how they perform in each period. We take things like exertion, acceleration throughout each period, throughout the week. And we also, I should mention, we do chip the players, but we also, which we haven't seen in the NFL released yet, we also have a chip in the ball. And the chip in the ball actually weighs a little under 4 grams. It's sitting underneath the NFL shield. And it's melded into the bladder, but the chip itself calculates velocity, RPMs, rotational information, and we can also derive height information for all passes and kicks. Now, the NFL is still evaluating how to release this information to the teams and to us as fans and in the media. But the Senior Bowl gave us an opportunity to actually release the ball data that was captured during that week. So we have great information on the players like Josh Allen and Baker Mayfield, not just to name 2 players who are high profile down there. And the professional teams that we work with are very excited to see some of this ball data for those young quarterbacks.
Yeah, and of course, what's so amazing about this is that, again, some of the stuff obviously is going to be team oriented, so nobody's going to see it. But you go into NextGen Stats, which is an open site that the NFL puts out, and you'll see some of the things. Like, for example, what are some of the positive things that you see numbers-wise on a quarterback like Russell Wilson, aside from being able to be in the pocket for about 3 seconds or running around and have 3 seconds plus to throw?
Yeah, a couple of things I saw about Russell, and obviously we're fortunate here in Seattle. I can't play favorites; I work in the league, but we have a great quarterback, in the Seahawks, Russell Wilson. But one of the stats I found interesting is that there's a stat with the tracking data that we're able to collect that basically quantifies is a quarterback throwing into tight windows. And tight windows is defined as is a defender 1 yard or less away from the intended receiver at the time the ball actually arrives to the receiver. And Russell Wilson was actually 9th lowest in the league in terms of throwing into tight windows. Now, again, I'm sure everybody can appreciate there's context that you want to put around that number. But I think when you look at that eliminates the potential for interceptions. It also optimizes the potential for a high completion percentage or high quality completion percentage. And so that was an interesting number that I saw. Another one that was fascinating to me was that Russell ranked 4th best in the league in terms of his air yards to the sticks. And what that means basically in regular lingo that we all talk about is the quarterback throwing in front of the stick, and depending upon when they're going for a first down, are they throwing in front of the stick and depending upon the intended receiver to make the yardage up after catch, or are they hitting are they throwing beyond the stick right to the player and to convert to that first down? And Russell was 4th best in that in terms of positive yards beyond the stick. And what it does mean is that Russell is, in essence, relying less on yards after catch and more on his delivery of the football to the intended receiver. One other thing I found interesting with Russell Wilson, he had the 11th furthest ball in the air during the entire season. And this was not calculated from the line of scrimmage. It's calculated from the release point to the landing point. And he had the 11th highest throw in the air at 57 yards. For context, the longest throw of the year in that same stat category was Jared Goff, and he had a throw of 61.8 yards in the air.
And now I know one guy that's probably played himself into a $6 million a year contract, if not more, is Paul Richardson, the wide receiver taken a few years ago, who's a free agent right now. What things have you seen about him as far as what improved and put him on a good plane?
Yes, it's a great question. Thanks, John. And so Paul Richardson ranked 8th highest in his air yards per target. And same context now for a wide receiver. How far down the field is he when he's targeted with a pass? And he was 8th highest in the league with 15 yards. And so, but his percentage of total air yards for the Seahawks team was relatively low for someone who is basically a deep threat and a deep threat wide receiver. So I would see the potential for Paul Richardson gaining confidence not only in the system, but maybe getting under a new offensive coordinator, perhaps getting more opportunities next year as a deep threat and somebody who becomes more of a prevalent targeted receiver next year.
Final question is, how tough is it to try to get a lot of people who have been in the league, say 25, 30, maybe 40 years, to understand and get into the new language of what's going to happen with Zebra and what's going on with all these stats?
Well, John, that's the art part of the job that I have. It's frankly the most fascinating part of the job. It can be a challenge for sure. But I think what we've learned, and myself personally as well, is that when we do present the information or the opportunity to utilize the information to teams, is that we really, lead in, if I may, with open palms. To position ourselves as more of a facilitator, an enabler, again, a premium ingredient, a new information resource that supports and works within current processes and procedures. I've not had a successful meeting one time where if the discussion just centered purely around the technology and the information. And so it's a process. And I would say, over the last 12 to 14 months or so, let's say the last season, and maybe let's call it 18 months, I've seen a significant change in terms of the cultures of the organizations that I've talked to, and I've talked to most of them over the last 18 months, of how they look at technology and information more as not just a nice to have, but a necessary ingredient that now needs to be included in the process and procedures of scouting, game management, and coaching, and also player evaluation, rehab, and training. So I've seen a huge sea change in acceptance and comfort at the executive level, from a general manager, to the head coaches and the coaching staffs around the league. I say also, probably makes sense too, we've seen a pretty big change in the front office. I mean, the age, the profile of people now getting general manager jobs and head coaching jobs. A lot of these new people have come from an information age background and a culture, so they're a little more comfortable with technology and information and how it fits into their everyday work.
Fantastic stuff. Again, it's Zebra, and of course, the game is on now because last week everything was announced. All 32 teams are getting all this information, and they're studying hard. Hey, John Pollard, thanks for joining us here on Schooled with the Professor.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate it.
And that does it for this week's podcast. In between episodes, you can follow me on Twitter at Clayton ESPN. If you enjoy these weekly one-on-one conversations, consider leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening to the show. Thanks for listening. See you next time on Schooled with the Professor.